So today's Bible lesson is based off of Genesis chapter 41, and this is the conclusion of a subsection of the Joseph novella. It wraps up this Joseph's first leg in Egypt, where he first found himself to be advancing in rank in the house of Potiphar, and then cast into prison based off of a false accusation at the end of chapter 39, and then chapter 40 found him in prison, but also being promoted from within prison and giving good advice and interpreting dreams to fellow prisoners, leading to the death of the baker, but the cupbearer being restored to his role. And he was meant to tell the Pharaoh about Joseph, but he either forgot or failed to do so. What happened there isn't exactly clear, which brings us 2 years later along the timeline to Joseph still being in prison at the start of this chapter, but finding a quick rise to the top. And then they will conclude this section of Joseph's story. And then when we pick up again in a couple of weeks, we'll move on to the story of Joseph interacting with his brothers who find themselves in Egypt and unable to recognize him. So we'll go ahead and begin reading, because this is a rather lengthy chapter. And so we have a lot of ground to cover, and we'll want to get through it. And it goes, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second dream. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. In the morning, his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. So by now, we have become familiar with these cycles of dreams and interpretations. This is the 3rd pairing of dreams, the first 2 being the ones that Joseph had about his family members, his brothers, and his parents bowing down before him. And then, of course, in the last lesson, the story of the cupbearer's dream and the baker's dream. And now it is the Pharaoh who dreams. And in keeping with the pattern of previous chapters, the dreams come in couplets. And as we read last week, 2 dreams in the same theme are considered particularly reliable. So the first one, you may think, hey, that was sort of odd. The second one, along similar lines, gets your attention, is the idea. In verse 8, we read how Pharaoh sent for the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And some translations translate magicians as religious experts. Either way, the word for religious experts in the story may be borrowed from the Egyptian language. It doesn't really fit with the Hebrew, and so we might be finding a rendering of an Egyptian word for this word that we translate as magicians or religious experts, which I like because it firmly plants this story in an Egyptian context. It's not like the Hebrews are writing a story about Egypt from the outside. They're borrowing some of the language, and later we'll see some of the other themes from Egypt to suggest a very thorough familiarity with Egypt and Egyptian culture and Egyptian ways, which I like. Now, these religious experts are officers that are found only in Pharaoh's court, and later they have the ability to duplicate some, but not all, of Moses' amazing acts. And you can read about that in Exodus chapter 7. We touched on these people last week when we were wondering how common it was for somebody to be an interpreter of dreams, and why the Pharaoh would have sought out somebody to interpret the dreams, and why it would have mattered so much that Joseph was able to do this. And it seemed that there was a sort of cottage industry, as it were, of persons in and around the king's court whose responsibility was to provide insight and wisdom and advice, but also to interpret dreams. And apparently they weren't fit for the task for these dreams. Which leads to the chief cupbearer finally remembering. Verse 9 reads, "Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Fritham writes, these events trigger the cupbearer's memory, and he recalls his experience with Joseph, both his interpretation and its accuracy. Quite remarkable. He even uses the language of sin, as in 39:9 and 40 verse 1, to describe his forgetfulness. So that word translated, I remember my faults today, is actually language that is otherwise other places translated as sin. And this is an egregious error that he is owning up to. However, this human act changes the future for all concerned. And so if he had not had this 2-year lapse, who knows how the story may have been different. And it seems that the timing, however you want to look at it, is right for Joseph's advancement. Also, I should note that the cupbearer's testimonial no doubt instills in the Pharaoh the confidence you'll place in Joseph in the ensuing verses, because as you'll see, he immediately throws in with Joseph and begins to anticipate that Joseph is going to be able to help him out. So perhaps it's on the testimony of the cupbearer that Pharaoh bases his confidence. Verse 14, then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Fritham writes, Pharaoh hurriedly brings Joseph from the pit, signaling the end of his journey from the pit in chapter 37, verses 20 through 29. His shaving and fresh clothing symbolize the change in his circumstance. Pharaoh reports to Joseph what has been said about him. Pharaoh's expectations are high. Pharaoh's confidence, as I've said a few times already, in Joseph's abilities is likely the result of the cupbearer's testimonial. But Joseph deflects the praise lavished on him. Joseph always gives God credit for interpreting dreams. In effect, he puts God on notice that an interpretation will be needed. At stake are the reputations of both Joseph and God. So here we see evidence that Joseph really has confidence in his connection with God, his ability to interpret the dreams. And if he did not have that ability, then he would have found himself flat on his face, made a fool, and perhaps punished for not being able to make good on this claim to interpret the dreams. But also at stake is not only Joseph's reputation, but the God who has kept him safe up until this point. And so in a way, this is Joseph's way of sharing a witness or bearing a witness to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he does so with confidence. Verse 17, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly, and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. The thin and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before. Then I awoke. I fell asleep for a second time, and I saw in my dream 7 ears of grain, full and good, growing on one stalk, and 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouting after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. When I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. Hybert writes that detailed repetition of previous events is a common feature of stories from the biblical world. It's a common storytelling technique. In other words, it's part of the way that they wrote and the way that they told stories, to repeat a story almost word for word with some subtle differences. And there are some subtle differences in Pharaoh's retelling of his own dream that was before narrated to us, not from Pharaoh's perspective, but from the narrator's perspective. Now the story, the dream is told in the first person. Pharaoh tells the dream to Joseph, and the retelling, as I said, basically matches the first report, yet the differences are important as they tell you something about the impact that these dreams have had on Pharaoh. As I said, they are in the first person, and they anticipate that the meaning is negative. In other words, Pharaoh is feeling great trepidation. He is not believing that these dreams are going to have any good news behind them. And also they reveal Pharaoh's deep concern by way of exaggeration. The first story did not describe the cows as the ugliest cows that had ever been seen in the land of Egypt. Or as Pharaoh puts it, never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. So perhaps sitting with the dream for some hours, the ugliness is even more impressed upon him. And also this additional bizarre information that eating the ugly cows eating the healthy cows did not change their appearance. So they're still as ugly as they ever were before. Pharaoh's more extreme depictions reveal just how troubled he has been made by these dreams. He knows that they mean something ominous is on the horizon. He intuits this is the idea. Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. After them, there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land because of the famine that will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Pharaoh writes the enclosing verses, verses 25 and 32, stress the dream's identical meaning and significance. Verses 26 through 27 focus on the number 7. Verses 29 through 31 on the subsequence of the events. The author introduces each by a statement that God has revealed to Pharaoh what will happen. The interpretation centers on the years of famine, the better to impress upon Pharaoh the need to take action. Why else would you give Pharaoh a heads up if there was not something he could do about it? But before we move on, I want to say a few things about the Nile River and the Nile Delta. And there you have a picture of it right there. And you might think of the Delta portion at the top, the very green, lush portion shaped something like a triangle, as the top, upper Egypt, and then the bottom part of the picture as lower Egypt. But actually in the Egyptian world, they thought of that completely reversed. Upper Egypt was the part down towards the bottom of your screen, and lower Egypt consisted of the Nile. And every time I think about the Nile Delta in cities like Memphis that would have been located there, I get a little sad from the vantage point of somebody who loves Egyptian history, because in that space, it's very swampy, very wet, and the great, beautiful, wonderful cities that would have been built there are now lost to decay and rot, because in wet environments, things don't last very well, as opposed to the pictures of the pyramids that you may have seen and the temples that you have seen, which are in Upper Egypt, where it is drier, and so that's why they are kept. And so I'm oftentimes wondering what remains buried in that swamp and what has been lost. But I digress. I only bring this up to point out that the Nile River is the site of Pharaoh's dream, and Egypt has been described as the gift of the Nile. From ancient times, nearly all of Egypt's people lived in the Nile Valley and depended on this river to survive. Today, the Nile Valley makes up less than 5% of Egypt's land area, but it's home to over 95% of its population. Egypt's agricultural economy has been one of the most stable in the Middle East, and add my own in parenthetical insert, for thousands of years stable. That's why the Egyptian empire was able to last some 3,000 years with some changes in dynasties, but relative stability for most of it. And this was due to the regular flow of the Nile, which is fed by rains and rivers across a broad area of northeastern Africa. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. Famine is therefore a remarkable event, more unusual in Egypt than in Canaan, where rainfall was always variable. And every year, I also should also add, there was what's called the inundation, where the Nile would rise from its banks and deposit for a couple of miles on either side uh, new sediments and soil that, when it receded, would ensure that the land was fertile, and so the farmers could grow year in and year out without the thought that the soil would lose its nutrients and its richness. And so it's a very unique part of the planet, and it's still that way today. And it is still farmed in similar ways today, right along the banks of the Nile. All this to say, what the Pharaoh's dreams foretold was truly remarkable, perhaps unprecedented news. That's why I'm bringing all of this up. This idea that there would be a famine in this space, in this land, where you could so reliably count on the inundation of the Nile and regular, reliable harvests. This is terrible news. There would not have been a generation alive in that time that could have recalled a similar thing happening. So the coming famine was sure to have a devastating impact, not only on Egypt, but the entire region, as Egypt was known as the breadbasket of that area. Which is why in the coming chapters, we'll see folks from Canaan travel to Egypt, knowing that there's a greater chance of being a food source there. But more on that in coming weeks. Now back to the story. Verse 33. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a man. This is Joseph's advice to Pharaoh after interpreting the dream. Let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So here Joseph does more than interpret the dreams. He provides a plan of action. And he's also showing himself to be quite wise by having this plan at his disposal. It's almost like he's shooting from the hip, but it's the exact right answer. And his proposal will therefore reinforce Pharaoh's high esteem for him. Fritham writes, Pharaoh should not resign himself to the disaster as if all the famine's effects were a matter of fate. Pharaoh has the freedom to make decisions, though within a context provided by God's decision. Joseph believes that he can persuade Pharaoh to develop a plan of action so that Egypt will be able to endure the famine in a way that brings the greatest possible well-being to all, not just the Egyptians, but to neighboring countries and peoples as well. Verse 37. The proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Now, Joseph emphasizes throughout that God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to Pharaoh. So Joseph thereby identifies a direct relationship between Pharaoh and God. God has shown Pharaoh something, and for his own good. And Pharaoh here in these verses recognizes that it is the Spirit of God that is working through Joseph, as if the Pharaoh knows something about this and knows that it is God, and God who has shown Joseph these things. And notice in this story, Pharaoh isn't saying you're God. It's as if they share a similar cosmology and a belief in a similar God. And in this story, another question as to what's going on here in relation to the pantheon of gods in Egypt, which have been by this time a very real and present thing, as we will see in some verses to come here in a few moments. Fritham goes on to write that this emphasis, where Pharaoh is giving the credit to God, this emphasis, along with Pharaoh's candor and Joseph's candor, and bold speech, as well as his concern for national well-being rather than himself, convinces Pharaoh. While he gives all the credits to God, Joseph obviously mediates the divine revelation. Here we see how Joseph becomes a conduit between God, God's actions, and God's graces and the entire Egyptian empire. Remember the theme where again and again Abraham is told that he will be a blessing, his children will be a blessing to all nations? Well, here's a clear example of a child of the Abrahamic covenant bringing blessing and well-being to other nations. This is how it is always meant to be. This is one of the most cogent examples of it actually happening. Verse 42, removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, as his wife. Thus, Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. So this is basically Joseph's given carte blanche. No one's going to be able to lift up a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt unless Joseph knows it. Of course, that's hyperbole, but you get the idea. Hybert writes, because of Joseph's wisdom, he gains power over all Pharaoh's other officials. His position is second only to Pharaoh, a post known as the vizier in Egyptian records. So we know the position that he's being appointed to. There are records of it and others holding this spot. It's impossible to place this story in any known historical setting in Egyptian history. We don't know where on the timeline of Egyptian history we're meant to place this, yet the idea of a foreigner achieving high status in the Egyptian administration isn't entirely fanciful. Egyptian records identify some non-Egyptians in high official roles during the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Although I should note too that it's usually seen in Egyptian records as a sign that things are not going well when a foreigner is in control. Probably the most notable foreign official to rule over Egypt as the Pharaoh, in fact, was the historical Cleopatra, who was Greek. So there are times where this does happen, but it's usually seen as times of instability. But in this story, it's all good for Egypt, all good for Egypt. Handel writes, Pharaoh's signet ring bore the king's seal. Hybert writes, Pharaoh's signet ring bore the king's seal. It gave Joseph the authority to act and to validate documents on the king's behalf. Linen clothes worn by high officials in Egypt and in Israel, and then the gold necklace was a symbol of distinction given by the king to those with special favor. And one last flourish, which I really like, Joseph's sumptuous new garb as Pharaoh's favored one recalls and transcends the fine robe he wore as Israel's favorite son back in chapter 37. This is Joseph's last change of clothes in the story. And so it's like an update in a bigger, better coat of many colors, or a coat with long sleeves. Remember, the last one got him to all sorts of trouble. This is the one that sees him elevated out of the pit and on his way to grandeur. Joseph's new name symbolizes his new status. Zephanath-Paneah is Egyptian and means either God speaks, he lives, or sustainer of life. Both meanings reflect the activity of Joseph in these narratives as the giver of life, obviously. Asenath means, this is his wife's name, she who belongs to the goddess Neith. She is the daughter of a powerful religious figure. Heliopolis is just north of Cairo. Heliopolis is the modern name for ancient On, as mentioned in this text. Joseph, now a high official, marries a woman of Egypt's royal house. Earlier generations of Israel's ancestors had married only members of their family from Haram. As a result, it's interesting that Joseph marries outside the family. And also, there is no negative connotations to be derived from this. It's not that he's doing something wrong here. It's seen positively as Joseph is infused into Egyptian life for its own sake and for its own life. Joseph, in his role as God's conduit and revelator, finds himself fully immersed in Egyptian culture. He is given an Egyptian name and takes a wife who has close ties to an Egyptian religious institution. Joseph's full-on immersion into Egyptian life is not judged in negative terms in the story. Instead, we are given a portrayal of cooperation and positive relations between Abraham's offspring and a foreign power. And we will find in later books of the Pentateuch, this is not usually the case, which is one reason what makes this story so appealing to me, how we see Egypt and the children of Abraham both benefiting in a way that doesn't exploit the other or bring the other down. Verse 46, it goes, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so 5 years younger than me, and he's in charge of the whole place, the whole shebang. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it. It was beyond measure. Joseph is 30 years old when these events occur, 13 years after his enslavement. So it's been a long time coming. And as prime minister, he carries out the economic program needed to prevent the disaster that Pharaoh's dreams portend. During the 7 years of plenty, more than could actually be measured, he stores up food in all the cities. The image of sand in the sea continues the blessing of the family of Abraham. And so that line there, like the sand of the sea, remember Abraham's children were going to be as plenteous as the sand of the sea. And so it's a linguistic cue into the reality that Joseph, a child of Abraham, is blessing another nation, as in all nations shall be blessed by Abraham's seed, blessing another's nation. And this is in keeping with the Abrahamic covenant. This was the intent of the Abrahamic covenant, that the people should be a blessing. Verse 50. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons, from whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore him. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all my hardships in all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. Pharaoh writes, the fruitfulness of Joseph and Asenath mirrors the fruitfulness of the land. They have 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph names them in recognition of God's involvement in this massive change in his life. Hybert writes, their descendants become the 2 most powerful tribes in the northern region of Israel. As the children of Asenath, they are half Egyptian. Joseph names them to express his and their identity. Joseph is now both a successful Egyptian official and a Hebrew in exile from his family in Canaan. Verse 53. And bear with me, this is a long chapter, but we're getting there. It reads, the 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. Just as Joseph had said, there was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, what he says to you, do. And since the famine had spread all over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world. And not to hammer the same point over and over again too hard, but that line, all the world came to Joseph, the child of Abraham, in Egypt to find food that would give them life, is again one of the most cogent examples of a child of Abraham living in line with the Abrahamic covenant, where they were to be a blessing to all the world. So Egypt then continues to live up to its reputation as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, but in a unique way and under special circumstances. Egypt is a blessing to the world around it by way of God's blessing, by way of Joseph and his role as God's prophet and mediator. Joseph's habitation in Egypt becomes the mode by which God blesses all nations. Some closing thoughts. Pharaoh writes, God's work of blessing in this chapter includes the entire human race, not just the chosen ones. God works in Pharaoh's life in ways Pharaoh does not know, even communication in and through a dream. This experience testifies to significant levels of divine activity in human lives outside the community of faith. At the same time, the chosen have the God-given mandate and capacity to enhance God's blessings in such a way that enables them to become more than they would be without human participation. He writes again, both Joseph and his brother Judah, see chapter 38, marry women outside the family and its religious heritage. Later legends speak of Asenath's conversion, but Genesis has no such interest in this. The text attests to a remarkable capacity for the integration of Yahwistic faith in other religious communities and expressions, similarly in 2 Kings 5:15 through 19. Many Old Testament texts do not tolerate such practices, but the reasons are contextual rather than normative. In other words, the dangers of syncretism drive the fear of synchronization, the fear of integrating Yahwistic faith with other religious communities. Joseph functions as an ideal for Israel at this point, demonstrating that the later intolerance is not characteristic of the Yahwistic faith in and of itself. Joseph illustrates that such integration can be a positive experience and need not carry negative effects. One last question. How might this story speak in our own time? So remember, this is a story about God's people blessing an entire nation and then all nations by the distribution of food, a wise and thought out distribution of food. In other words, there was enough food the entire time, and if it had not been distributed in a wise and thoughtful way, then many people would have starved, right? Because the 7 years of blessing were going to happen regardless. It seems it's a matter of saving the food and then sharing it with those who need it. Well, this is information from Rubicon.com, some food waste facts from an article, Food Waste in America, Facts and Statistics. This is as recent as 2021. Each day in the United States, approximately 1 pound of food per person is wasted. This equates to 103 million tons of food waste generated in America in 2017, or in other words, between 30 and 40% of the food supply, according to the United States Department of Agriculture. How much food is wasted in the U.S. can be seen directly through its monetary losses. The annual food waste in America has an approximate value of $161 billion, while the average American family of four throws out $1,500 in wasted food per year. So loss of $161 billion in funds represented by food that goes into landfills, and 30 to 40% of the food supply ends up in landfills. As it stands, the U.S. is the worldwide leader in food waste generation, with the majority of wasted food being sent to landfills. In fact, food waste is the number one material in American landfills, around 24.1% of all municipal solid waste, according to the EPA. So 1/4 of what you're looking at in a landfill is food that does not find an empty belly. So closing thoughts. It's just where my mind went. I think that if God were calling the shots, not one morsel of food would wind up in a landfill so long as persons in the world are starving. How might the Joseph we meet in this story, how do you think the Joseph we meet in this story would respond to our current status quo? That's an interesting question. And I really don't have any clear answers. I guess what we need today more than ever is a Joseph. There's my sources. And we're back. Thanks for sticking with us. I'm looking at the clock. That was a half hour, most of it reading text, and I didn't really see any other way around it. It was going to be a long one today. But so I'll turn it over to you. Thoughts, comments, what's going on in your minds?
Hi, Nancy. Yeah. Well, I was thinking, this story all begins with the dream and God speaking to us. And I think we need God. Well, okay, let me rethink that. God does speak to us. He gives us his word and he tells us to feed the hungry and to take care of them. So if I'm reading his word, that's what we should be doing. I don't know how we're going to make our food that we don't want or it's expired, how we're going to get it to people that need it, but
it's really a matter of organization and logistics. I mean, so one thing that where my mind went as I was considering this issue of food waste is you could have easily seen the Egyptians without the foresight that there would be the 7 years of famine. You could have easily seen them squandering the food, throwing out what they couldn't eat, not building bins to store it for the time that they would need it. And because they organized themselves in anticipation for the need, then they were able to accommodate the need when it happened. A little different today because we have the need running along parallel with the abundance. So it's really a matter of distribution, and it would take an overwhelming, mind-boggling systemic overhaul of how we produce food and where it goes and why it goes to where it goes. And I don't have the answer. I'm just troubled by it.
I do think in this pandemic, we've discovered that we may not always be able to get the food we want to get, or toilet paper.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So in a way, we've kind of been in a drought. There are still some things that I used to buy before all this started that I can still not get. I don't know whether they're not producing it or whether my suppliers are just no longer carrying it. And I went to the store today to get some juices for John and Jay to take in the car with them. And basically, the area on the shelf was bare. There was almost nothing there. So I'm wondering why I can't get that now. So maybe we're having our own 7 years and we don't know it.
Well, yeah. I think too, it's like food choices. Because I just had, this is silly, but I think it represents like how we consume food. One of the things that we throw out because we can't compost it necessarily is like salad dressing, because it goes to waste. We have to throw it out. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, maybe every time we just put together olive oil and vinegar and with some herbs and whisk it together. And then we'd never have that packaging to put into some waste dump somewhere if we can't recycle that. And then we wouldn't have that whatever icky goo that can't be composted going into it can't go down the garbage disposal. It can't go in the compost. So it has to go in the trash. And so I don't know, there's like a whole, it's kind of depressing, but it's like taking that all apart and thinking about what food is really most sustainable for the planet and what it creates the least waste and what's best for us to eat. It's just kind of overwhelming sometimes.
It's really overwhelming. I was kind of thinking the same way of you, Judy, that our way of eating is different. Can you not hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Our way of eating is different because we buy things in cans and jars and things like that. Whereas then they were making their food and probably consuming it as they ate it. As they fixed it. They weren't making in abundance because they didn't have a way to store it. In some ways, food banks are taking on that. They will get from grocery stores what's not out of date, but since the grocery stores are getting more recently produced products, then those are going to food banks. And I'm not saying that's the cure-all, but it is one way that we're storing things and getting it to the people who need it. Like Gleaners goes to grocery stores and picks stuff up. And I watch the grocery stores as they're clearing stuff off the shelves because they're getting new stuff in. It is tricky because of the way we have our food prepared almost for us.
Yeah, it's true. But it would just take a whole rethinking. I know I have friends who live in Boulder and they have some kind of initiative, and I don't know if it's just like a popular initiative or if they've actually made it a citywide thing. They want to reduce their waste to practically nothing by a certain year. So you would take your containers to the store and fill them up with your grains or your flour or your oils or whatever it is you're going to cook with, eat cereals. They would try to do away with boxes and disposable things and get those items that you need. And that might actually cut back on waste, because then you're only filling up your food sources with the things that you've depleted. So I don't know, that's kind of an interesting concept. I don't know how well it's going to work.
Some grocery stores have gone that direction. Trader Joe's is probably one of the biggest one, where they have bulk items and you can buy what you need. You don't have to overbuy. If you don't have to buy a huge container if you only have a small amount of something, but it's mostly dry goods.
Right. Well, they're going to do like everything, like dairy and I guess. I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know what that's going to look like or how they're going to pull that off. But
we're all going to go milk our own cow.
Yeah, we're going to go milk our own cow.
Well, we used to be able to return the milk bottles. We bought the milk. We took the milk bottles back. You know,
we used to take our Coca-Cola bottles back.
All kinds of glass bottles were. I don't know, you got pennies back on them, if you know, but you could take them back and recycle them, and they would clean them and use them again. It wasn't like they were just going to be crushed up and recycled that way. The actual container was cleaned and recycled.
We used to have a milkman that came, and then we put the empties out, and he brought us the new.
That's
and
right.
Our eggs used to come in cartons that were biodegradable. As now we've got all the styrofoam. I was looking just at not a food item, but bare aspirin in a container that was about this tall, supposedly had the low-dose aspirin. And in the container was about this much aspirin. 300 were in there, but they're tiny. And the container was like 4 times bigger than it needed to be. I mean, we do an incredible amount of waste in packaging.
Which is different than food, but still it's part of
the problem.
Yeah.
I suspect that's tied with why so much food ends up in landfills. It's just not a matter of producing way too much. It's just a matter of how it's distributed. And I thought the other day when I was handed a packet of, a plastic fork and a plastic spoon with a packet of salt and pepper and a napkin. I only needed the fork. Which I used, and I thought to myself, and I mean this quite literally, such a thing should not exist.
Right.
This I should have, if it was normative to have your own cutlery and silverware when you thought you might need it, that you would take home and wash, or that the place that you got whatever food from would take home and wash. It's mostly to-go items, right?
But schools are getting things like that. So all those little packages of napkin and forks, whatever, that they were giving to us at the food pantry. And then we were just putting handfuls in the bags that we were giving out. But here again, they were going to be disposed of some way.
Right. And you didn't know if those were people who had a permanent place to live, if they had access to cutlery. And so in that case, you're probably doing a favor, but still it's a long-term issue about waste. And so
well, I would kind of like to change the thought a little bit, and not so much about food, but I've often heard it said that Joseph was considered a type of Christ character, and in that way, when we think about Christ, we are to feed the world. And that is what he's feeding, not only Egypt, but the countries around. And that should be part of our goal too, to not just feed our own area where we live, but all around the world.
That's my favorite thing about this story that was really impressed upon me was I never had until this study for this lesson seen Joseph as just living into the Abrahamic covenant in a very large, expansive way. I never thought of it that way before. It seemed like a story disconnected from what came before it. And then those little phrases like sand of the sea, the food being the amount of the sand of the sea, and blessing all the nations. It's a culmination of what Abraham was meant to go and do. And we forget that with what comes after the fact, with the Exodus and tribal warfare that will carry on basically throughout a large part of the Pentateuch. But here, you can just, I guess, compartmentalize the story and take it as a shining example of what's possible. And
we saw that with the pandemic, the farmers that were stuck with food that they couldn't get to the stores or to market, and then they were having to destroy it, and some of them came up with creative ways of getting it out themselves, getting it so that they weren't throwing it away. Our big problem is once our crisis is over, we forget those things.
Well,
and it occurred to me when I heard this, when you looked at the follow-up points, I didn't think about food, but I immediately thought of the vaccine. And that is something that we can send, to the whole world. And there's a conflict there, do you use it for your own country first, or, do you send it out to, the third world or whatever? But seems that we do have an obligation, just like.
Well, I forget the man's name here. Let me look it up. But the man who you're probably familiar with the story that did the polio vaccine.
Right? Salk or Sabin, Jonas Salk, or the first guy was Sabin. Jonas Salk.
Salk and Sabin.
Well, let me find out.
That was actually on Jeopardy the other night.
Yes, it was. I think it was last night. Yeah.
Polio vaccine gift to the world is what I typed in. Jonas Salk. Yeah, he didn't patent the polio vaccine. He never profited off of it. He didn't patent it because he said it was a gift to the world. And we are benefactors. Who's worried about polio? There's some resurgences in certain places, localized places, but it's by and large eradicated and has been entirely eradicated for periods of our history. And Jonas Salk said that, I'm looking at the quote here to your, you can't see, I have the screen split, so I'm cut right here. I'll find the quote maybe as an inspirational. Oh, he said, Edward R. Murrow asked Jonas Salk, who owned the patent to the polio vaccine. Well, the people, I would say. Oh, he asked him. He asked who owned the patent to the polio vaccine, and Salk said, "Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?"
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's good.
That's true. And some of the vaccines are not nearly as effective as what ours are. Jay was sharing with me that they have started the vaccine in the Philippines, but it's 50%.
Yeah, which is not nothing, but nothing near as good as we have.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. They need something.
Well, I think too, we don't, we're pretty insular, and we don't know what goes on in the rest of the world. And we hear a lot about what goes on in our country, but we don't hear a lot about what's going on in Africa, for instance, or the Middle East. And Yemen is, I think, a really, really good example. I mean, maybe people have heard about Yemen, but there's a humanitarian crisis there where people are starving, and they may be in famine, and we wouldn't know it because there's been such a blockade on even communications, and there's been a blockade of food trucks and trying to get into the areas that are controlled by the so-called terrorists. I mean, in this case, they're all, everybody's bad, so it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Just get the food in there to the people who are suffering. And I think when we start taking political sides, there are a lot of people in the middle who are suffering and starving. And so I think
thing about economic economic sanctions don't impact the leaders we're trying to get to kowtow to our wills. They impact the poor by way of food, lack of food.
Yeah.
I have a friend who has 2 daughters that live in Canada, and she was saying that up there, they're giving the first shot, but they're waiting till everybody gets the first shot, and you can't even get the second one till 4 months down the line.
Yeah.
And
My cousin who lives in Canada came here to get one. And I have a friend who lives in Iceland, Reykjavik, Iceland, who's visiting his family to get, because he has a new child and would like, they haven't seen their grandchild, but while they're here, they're getting a vaccine. It's important. I have to pick up Josie here in a little bit, so I do have to hop off shortly, but pick her up from school. But the thing about the vaccine and why it's so important to get it distributed on a global scale. So if we're thinking if we must think purely selfishly, which we should, but say somebody you're talking to insists upon that frame of mind. If we don't vaccinate persons in other countries, whatever new variants may develop over the course of time are sure to have an impact on us.
That's right.
So even from a purely selfish motive, which I wish would not be I hope it's not, I know for you folks, it's not what drives you, but some people may. Even from a purely selfish motive, there is a great incentive to get a vaccine out to the world and to all persons, because it can come back to impact us.
The variants already are here with us.
Yes, and so far the vaccines work on the variants by and large. The question becomes what if, and it is a what if, but what if one should develop that does not?
I have one quick question if you're going to leave, because I wanted to verify something that I thought what it was. You had a picture which definitely looked like a excavation area. And I'm assuming that was like a storage pit or something to put the grain in. Okay.
Yep, that was a grain bin. Let me pull that up again. Yep, that was a grain bin. To give you an idea of what that might have looked like at the time. This is like a cartoon rendering, right? That's kind of how I would have imagined it. But in fact, something like that.
Wow.
Did you get the size on it or anything?
I think beside this picture was the size, and I didn't.
That's all right. That's okay.
You can get some.
And do you know where it was?
No, I don't. In Egypt. That's all I know.
Okay.
But I thank you for this. These Joseph stories have really brought out a lot of good conversation, and I look forward. So we're not going to meet until the 16th of June. I'm going on vacation after this coming Sunday, and so I will need Wednesday to prepare to leave on Thursday, and so I appreciate your patience with that. It's a good time to take a break because the story's about to pivot into a new chapter, as it were. And so I thank you for your time. And Janet, when I get off here, I'm going to email you a link to the last week's lesson just to make sure that you, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Enjoy your vacation.
Get some rest and
appreciate it.
And regenerate yourself.
That's right.
All right.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.